Hello and welcome to the Pondering Papaya podcast as we look ahead to the Spanish Grand Prix. After another podium last time out in Canada, McLaren are back to try and continue that momentum in Spain, but they haven't always had the best of time of it in Barcelona, having not scored a podium since 2011. Joining me to discuss McLaren's chances and all the other news is the host of the brilliant DNF1 Podcast Adam Burns, so let's get straight into it. So joining me now is Adam. First of all, huge thanks to you, Adam, for joining. How are you doing today? Are you, away from F1, are you enjoying the Euros? I mean, we've all got Euro fever, surely.
Yeah, not too bad, thanks, Sam. Yeah, the Euros has been quite fun so far. I can't really say there's been too many games that have bored us. I mean, there's the obvious England game that I'm sure many people listening to this is like, oh, the English lads are going to be going on about it's coming home and all that stuff. We'll see. But it's been a good tournament so far. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. But of course, F1 is back this weekend after a weekend off. First of a triple header. So we're sort of really getting into the meat of the season, the European season. I'm going to say starts properly. Obviously, we've had a few European races, but then we've had the likes of Canada and Miami thrown in there. So this is sort of the proper start of the European season. So we've got Austria to come after this one and then Silverstone, obviously, after that. So first of all, Spanish Grand Prix, Circuit de Barcelona, Catalunya, a circuit very familiar to drivers, teams, fans. I mean, up until 2022, it was used as the pre-season testing track. So,
like I said, we're going to be back
if any driver says they're missing miles or laps, that's surely not going to happen this weekend. Like, that's not really an excuse for this weekend. It's 66 laps over 4.657 kilometers. And when you look at the previous winners, there's only a few names you need to remember. So obviously, Max won last year, he won the year before, and in fact, you have to go back to 2015. Quiz question for you, Adam. Who was the last person not called Lewis Hamilton or Max Verstappen to win at this venue?
We're going to be back on Monday for a
Oh man, wow. That is... I'm going to say Nico Rosberg.
You're correct. That is a very good guess. Yeah, 2015 was the last time someone not called Hamilton or Verstappen has won at this venue. So pretty much a dominant track for those two, obviously, during different eras. I mean, starts time, 3 o'clock local track time, so obviously you can work out in your area what time it starts. But looking at McLaren in particular, and I think this was what can be... I mean, I've said this a few times already this year, but last season was a nightmare race, really. So Norris qualified really well, but made contact with Hamilton at the opening lap, pitted with damage, and would go on to finish 17th. Piastri, meanwhile, qualified 10th and finished 13th, and we were still sort of before the McLaren car became a rocket ship. So this was the last European race. I mean, the order was a little bit different the last time round. So we had Spain, then Canada. So Canada was the last race before the upgrades in Austria. But this was the last European race before the Austria, obviously, big turning point. So they're coming here with a lot of momentum, but it's not been a hugely successful track for them. So they've won here 8 times, which is the third most. And in fact, if they win at this venue this weekend, they'll tie Mercedes for the second most wins behind Ferrari's 12. But they haven't won since Kimi Räikkönen in 2005. So it's been a long old time since McLaren have had any kind of joy. And in fact, even podium-wise, their last podium was in 2011 with Hamilton. So it's a long time since McLaren have had anything to be excited about this venue. Really, it's not been a happy hunting ground. But Adam, going into this weekend, obviously we can sort of talk about the last few years, but I think everyone agrees this McLaren team's much better than it has been for a long time. So, what are your overall thoughts? We'll sort of drill down to the specifics. But going into this weekend, like what you think is possible for the McLaren team?
I think sky's the limit, really, isn't it? I mean, it's crazy how little than just under a year ago, we were talking about McLaren. Will they get to that together? They were, struggling at the back. This was the last race, as you pointed out, before the huge upgrade started to come. And then we finally got to see what McLaren could really do. And they've really kicked off from then and, gotten stronger and stronger. They're now a regular fixture, not only fighting at the top end for the big points, but also for podiums and race wins. And I think there's a fair argument to be made, Sam, that in the last 4 races, McLaren have only won 1. They had a fair argument to say they probably could have had the car to win all 4 of those races, but for different reasons, they didn't happen. So heading into this weekend, I see absolutely no reason why McLaren are very much aren't going to be in the hunt again. And I think they have to aim to try and win the Spanish Grand Prix. And if they don't, it will probably be because either one team has done a better job than them or they were just unlucky.
Yeah, and I think you speak in very similar tones to what Lando and Oscar was saying recently. Obviously, previously Norris was happy with a podium and stuff like that, but you can see his mentality this year has really changed. He's not going to be happy with anything less than a win, which obviously reflects what McLaren have done the last few years. And I think going into this venue, I mean, any of the build-up, you're going to hear how McLaren at high-speed circuits. So people don't know that McLaren traditionally have always been quite good at high-speed corners. And I mean, think about last year, their circuits they were really good at, the ones that high speed, medium speed, traditionally not so great at the low speed. But what we've seen in Canada, in Monaco, is they've really improved in the low speed corners. But now the question obviously is flipped on its head. It is, are they going to be good in high speed corners as well? And I think the team in particular sort of quite optimistic about it. So a little quote from Oscar Piastri says, I think we can still be confident. I think we wouldn't say we're weak in high speed. It's just that others have probably caught up a little bit. I think I'm pretty confident we'll be somewhere towards the front as well. I think Red Bull will probably be a bit stronger than they have been, but I think we'll be in the fight. So Piastri very confident that their low speed improvements isn't going to affect their high speed performance. But what about you, Adam? Do you think McLaren now have a totally different kind of car characteristically, or do you think we're sort of seeing more of an all-rounder that perhaps other than Red Bull we haven't really seen for the last few seasons?
I think it's probably more the latter. And, I think McLaren are definitely going to be tested this weekend at Barcelona on a track historically, Sam, that we both know there's no hiding place at Barcelona. If your car has weaknesses, they will be exposed at Barcelona more so than many other circuits. That's why it was always a popular test circuit for so many years with F1. So I think going into this weekend, they would know that off the back of the last few races that we both mentioned, McLaren were definitely very much in a position to try and win them and had the car to do so. They haven't really been tested too much with this new car on high-speed circuits. So I think this will be an interesting weekend to see how far McLaren have come and how far they have yet to go. But I think when you talk about the slow-speed corners, I think it's more of a case of McLaren maybe not surprising themselves. Maybe they were upbeat and confident that this car would be able to eradicate those issues. But they've certainly surprised everybody else at how far they've come and actually how far they are along at this point to be in a position where they're not far away from putting themselves in a position where they could challenge for championships. I don't think that's out of the question anymore. I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but there's no reason why they shouldn't feel right now that they have a car capable of fighting for wins almost everywhere they go. And I think if there's no trade-off for the high-speed performance that they were so famously good for last season, then, yeah, sky's the limit for McLaren. I think there's plenty of reasons to feel confident about them right now.
Yeah, and I think the only thing, not the only thing, but probably the main opponent to that, to any kind of McLaren success this weekend, is obviously a name that's often used to spoiling parties, which is Max Verstappen. I mean, his performance here last year was probably one of his most dominant races. He topped quali, he got the fastest lap, he won the race, and he led the Grand Prix from lap 1 to lap 66. And I think that's an incredibly impressive achievement, even if it's in a dominant era like we saw last year. Looking at Red Bull and obviously sort of expanding that to the teams around them, like, do you think it's still Red Bull are going to be the biggest challenges? Because they haven't had a perfect season. They've obviously lost a couple of races, and they've looked a bit more vulnerable than we've definitely seen in the last few years. And I think starting to maybe see not cracks as such, but weaknesses that can be exposed. But in theory, this should be a circuit that suits them, right? That should be more friendly than the Canadas and the Monacos with the very high curbs that obviously Max Verstappen's really raised a problem with. Said that's not suiting a car. What do you think about them going into this weekend? Do you think they're going to be the favourites? Do you think they're going to be the ones that challenge McLaren the most?
I think they have to be considered the favourites just based on the fact that they had such a huge advantage at the start of the season, based on what we saw from 2023. Yes, McLaren and, Ferrari as well, I suppose if you want to throw them in, have closed the gap to Red Bull to a point where they can challenge them for race wins everywhere they go at the moment. And I think with Max Verstappen, you always got to add that extra something special that can really take them over the edge. And I think we saw this in Canada where if Max Verstappen wasn't driving that Red Bull, it's probably likely that he doesn't win that race and Lando Norris wins another Grand Prix. So, yeah, I think for now, I would consider them favourites. But if you're a McLaren fan, listen to this, and I certainly hope that you are. I mean, where else would you be? But there's plenty of reasons to feel optimistic right now that Red Bull, if they're not sweating on what's happening at McLaren in particular, then they should be, because they are coming under threat for them every single weekend. And if Red Bull aren't at their absolute best, and I think Max Verstappen was at Canada through sheer fortune or just brilliant driving or a combination of the two, then the chances are they're going to get beat. So, yeah, I definitely think they're favourites, but it's nowhere near a foregone conclusion anymore.
Another team we should probably talk about is one that didn't have such a good time out last night in Canada. Obviously, that's Ferrari. Like, both drivers, am I correct? Yeah, both drivers retiring for different issues. Obviously, Leclerc had an engine problem. Sainz had a skill problem where he drove into a wall.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, it's probably going to be a very different race this weekend. And they're coming with upgrades. So obviously, we've had a few teams have a little bit of upgrades, but I think Ferrari sort of penned the Spanish Grand Prix as a chance to not fix the car, but certainly push them back up towards Red Bull. And I think a lot of focus, according to Formula Uno, obviously know a lot about Ferrari, is that it's going to be on the floor. So, Adam, with that in mind, and sort of not just better luck, but obviously not as bad luck as Canada. Like, do you think Ferrari going to bounce back this race and sort of be up there and thereabouts? Really?
I mean, the assumption would be that if Ferrari correct the issues that hampered them in Canada, I mean, there was a lot of talk about wrong tyre pressures and some setup issues when Ferrari were originally billed as a potential favourites of that Grand Prix, given how similar Canada can be to Monaco to a certain degree. I don't think that's 100% true. There are some clear differences. Ferrari should be back in the mix fighting for the victory, just like McLaren are this weekend with Red Bull. So if the upgrades, work as intended and give Ferrari that extra step forward, then there's absolutely no reason why Ferrari should be able to put Canada behind them and fight for the victory at Barcelona. And these are upgrades that, have been brought forward from where they're originally planned, just like McLaren have done in Miami. So, hopefully for them, they'll be in the mix as well. I don't see any reason why that won't be the case. But of course, as we've seen, there are no guarantees with anybody at the moment. So if Ferrari have an equally disappointing weekend in Barcelona, then that will start to raise some serious questions on a season that looked like it was going from strength to strength before Canada.
Just on that, were you surprised by well, obviously you were surprised by their performance in Canada, but it seemed very much pre-Vasseur, didn't it? Like these kind of mistakes we saw a lot during Matteo Bonotto, and you can go even further back than that. But it seemed like Fred Vasseur had stamped most of that out. Do you think? I mean, obviously you're a Ferrari fan. Are you looking at that concerned that this could be the start of something much worse, or do you think that's just a one-off? Things can happen to teams. Like they can get the strategy wrong, you can set up wrong. What's your sort of overall mood about that race and sort of the knock-on effects, really?
I think that's going to be the question that's pretty much put to Ferrari this weekend, and I think it's a really good one because a lot was made in the media about the surprise and shock factor of how poorly Ferrari had performed this weekend. I mean, even if we take away Charles Leclerc's engine problems and, Carlos Sainz's skill factor issue, if you like, Ferrari would never really had the pace at all that weekend. I don't think even the most supportive and confident Ferrari fan could make a fair argument to say they were ever in the mix alongside McLaren and Red Bull, or even Mercedes for that matter. So, looking at the Fred Vasseur Ferrari era, I think the one word that's been touted around a lot that probably edifies or sums up how Ferrari have been under him is calm. And I think Canada was anything but that. I think it was a lot of desperation, a lot of crazy strategies like Leclerc going on hard when it was clearly wet, and it was an achievement. He didn't bin it in turn one like Russell and Tsunoda had done in previous years when they did similar things. So I think for that reason, Sam, there is still going to be that element of calm at Ferrari. Yes, there'll be pressure to put things right, but I think under Fred Vasseur, I think we should trust Ferrari to be able to see where they went wrong, put things right, get the drivers' heads in the game. Obviously, being a home race for Carlos as well, it's going to be quite important. And just hope and expect them to put things right. I'm sure they will, but if they don't, then questions will start to surface, rightfully so. And, people will be asking, are Ferrari all of a sudden no longer calm? Are they making mistakes? Are they going back to pre-Vasseur Ferrari, as you pointed out? So we'll see, but I'm confident that they'll put that right this weekend.
Yeah, definitely something to keep an eye out for, and obviously someone that could massively help McLaren in the future. But you mentioned them there, and obviously sort of the last team I'll touch on is really Mercedes had such a great race. Obviously didn't win it, unfortunately, and I think they came P3 and P4. But they've really shown improvements probably since Miami. And we were chatting a little bit before we started of is this going to be where they are for the rest of the season, or is it going to be like we saw last year, very circuit specific? So what's your overall mood on that? Like, I think Barcelona, like you said earlier, there's no hiding place. It's a much different track than the last two we've just been on. So what are you expected to see from Mercedes this weekend? Sorry. Are they going to be up there with fight again, or are they going to sort of regress back to that Aston Martin sort of range down in P5, P6?
It's a really tough one to call If I was a betting man, I would probably say that they're probably going to be somewhere in between. I'd be surprised if Mercedes are up there fighting for the win like they were in Canada last time out. For all the reasons that we talked about earlier, that Barcelona is a circuit that exposes the weaknesses more so than any other circuit on the calendar, arguably. So for that reason, I think Mercedes still will find out that they have a ways to go. But I don't see any reason why they can't be at least in a position where if the other teams are struggling, they might be able to capitalize on this. I mean, this is a circuit last season where they did take a huge step forward. So, it's still Mercedes. And I think there's a fair argument to be made that George and Lewis at times in Canada drove really well. Yes, there were a few mistakes, but I see no reason why Mercedes can't be at least in the conversation. But I'd be very surprised if they were actually seriously contending for the win this weekend.
Mm-hmm. We've talked about the teams. Let's boil it down a little bit. Let's go to the drivers then. Let's start with Lando Norris. Obviously, he's an obvious starting point. I wrote in the show notes form of his career, and I think that's probably fair to say. Obviously, he had a very good end to 2023, but he's rarely had a bad race. But at this particular event, he's never finished higher than 8th, and surely that record changes this weekend, doesn't it, Adam?
Oh, it has to. And I think since winning in Miami, that, as we often expect with certain drivers, when they finally get that first win after such a long time, their focus starts to narrow in on the next target and try to win every single week. And the confidence comes with that. And I think we're seeing that with Lando. And this was a driver that was always confident in his abilities and was able to put it all together. We're starting to see that now week after week after week. And this is the difference between being a good driver and being a great driver. And I think with Lando Norris, we are starting to see that now. He's starting to go to that next level. And, the form speaks for itself. And I see no reason, Sam, why Lando Norris can't win this weekend, let alone finish in the top 8.
You just mentioned there, obviously, being the best at the very top end. Like, where is Norris now? Because I think for a long time, it was probably fair to say maybe Verstappen off on his own. Next level down, maybe Hamilton, Alonso. And then sort of you had a big group of, I want to say, like Norris, Leclerc, Russell. Where are you putting Lando now sort of on that scale? Like, is he up towards Max? Is he in sort of that Hamilton Alonso area? Granted, he hasn't won the world title like those two, but how good a driver is he sort of in comparison to where everyone else is on the grid?
Oh, well, it's like you described. There's so many layers to this. Honestly, I feel like we could do an episode where we could do a tier list, and it'd be so long, it'd be ridiculous. If I'm being brutally honest, I think Lando. Again, you have to analyze certain aspects to his arsenal as a driver. I don't think it's as simple or as binary as saying that, Lando is now, after winning a race, he's up there with some of the elite drivers. I think on pace, over one lap, I think he's as good as anybody when he's got the confidence and the grip underneath him. But after getting that win and seeing his form since, I think there's a fair case to be made that he is in that group along with the Leclercs, the Russells, the Sainz as well. And I think, from one week to another, I think there's a fair case to be made to say that he could be above them at some places and maybe below them at others. I don't see no reason why Lando doesn't belong in that category now. As I said, there's so many layers to this, but he's in that group now and he definitely belongs there. He has done for a while, but he's just needed that confirmation, if you like, in terms of a tangible victory or something like that, if you want to put it in that way, to actually prove that he is there and he belongs, rather than just be, I suppose, through narrative or through what people say on social media, really. It depends who you ask, but yeah, somewhere like that.
Mm-hmm. And let's move on to Oscar then. Obviously, I mean, in my head, he's had a good season. Not a great one. I think, obviously, last year he was outstanding in his rookie year, but I think he's had an okay season. But now look to the driver's table. He's 50 points behind Norris now. I'm wondering, where's that gap come from? Like, is that gap already too big for him to catch up, especially considering the form that Norris has been in so far this year?
Yeah, I think Oscar's probably been the victim of the fact that a few races where he could have been in the shout of winning and Lando has gone and done that. I mean, in Miami, he was quite unfortunate with Sainz where he lost a huge chunk of points there. There's an argument to be made that he could have won Monaco if Charles Leclerc didn't pull off one of the laps of his career to get pole position and then go on and win that race. So I think, people talk about Oscar's season so far, and I'd agree with you. I think he's had a pretty good season so far. I think the best way to look at it right now, Sam, is that Oscar is embarking on that next step in his development. And I think he has made that step up where he's now in a car that's capable of fighting for podiums and race wins. And he's not going away. He's not missing from that battle compared to Sergio Perez, for example, who is in a car that can do that. And at the start of the season, he was there. Now he's nowhere. So I think Oscar's made that next step forward. But then I think when you measure that against Lando, you have to take into account that Lando has made that next step up as well in his development. So they are moving in tandem with each other in that regard. Lando's not left Oscar behind, but Oscar's doing exactly what I think he needs to be doing in that McLaren seat. Of course, going forward and looking at seasons in the future, there will be an expectation for Oscar to progress just like Lando was done. But for right now, I think he's in the right place. I think he's doing a great job. And I only see him getting stronger and stronger.
What about as a team then? McLaren obviously in P3, but that gap to P2 is getting shorter and shorter. Obviously, Ferrari didn't score any points last time out, but only 40 points between McLaren and Ferrari in P2 now. And then there is a little bit of a gap. So Verstappen, I said Verstappen, that sort of shows how much it's a one-man team at the moment. Red Bull up on 301 points, about 50 ahead of Ferrari. In terms of goals for the rest of the season, we've still got a long way. It feels like we've had a good few races now, but there's still plenty of races to come. Where do you think McLaren are aiming for? Is it P2, which obviously would be their best result for a number of years, or do you think they have their eyes on P1 and maybe the fact that Verstappen is sort of doing it all on his own? Is that an opportunity both for McLaren and for Ferrari to sort of look at that constructors title and say, okay, we might not win the drivers title, but this is achievable considering we have two drivers who regularly score points while Red Bull don't?
Yeah, I think we're at 40% through the season now. I mean, it's crazy that we're at the 10th Grand Prix and we're finally embarking on the European section of the season. Crazy how times change. Literally, most season would have been almost all but done by now in the past. But yeah, if you'd have said to McLaren that they would have been 89 points, it is behind Red Bull and in third place and in contention for any one of those top three places by the end of the season, they'd have bit your arm off at this point of the season. I think if you're McLaren, based on where their car is right now and how their drivers are performing and also how consistently they are. I mean, they've scored more points than any other team in the last few races. I think at least 20 more than all the others. If they keep that form up, there's absolutely no reason why McLaren can't challenge for the Constructors' Championship. I'm being brutally honest at this point, Sam, and maybe I'm getting a bit carried away. But I think, in a way, because of the dynamic with Verstappen, really, picking up the points of Red Bull almost all on his own at the moment, there's probably an argument to be made here that perhaps Red Bull aren't McLaren's biggest threat to a Constructors' Championship. Perhaps it's Ferrari, for the fact that both those teams have cars that can win races at the moment, and they have two drivers that can score week in, week out at the top end of the pecking order. All right, Ferrari had their problems in Canada, but maybe that was a one-off. And Red Bull at the moment, I mean, let's be honest, they can only count on Max right now. And 89 points is not insurmountable in Formula One these days when you have the advantage that McLaren and Ferrari have. So I don't see any reason why McLaren can't aim to win the Constructors' Championship this season.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Obviously, there's always been the talk that Perez doesn't pull his weight. And I think the last few years, he hasn't really had to. He's scored enough points to help Max, but Max has almost done it on his own, really. And I think the fact that the cars are so close this year and the Red Bull don't have such a lead, it's really starting to show that Perez just isn't cutting at the moment. It's obviously, we're speaking after he's just signed a new two-year deal, but he hasn't been on the podium since China, and obviously Norris has been on the podium pretty much since every race since that, barring Monaco. Piastri's been on the podium as well since then. So I think you're entirely right that Red Bull might be looking at Perez and saying, can you at least get some good points? Max can't do it all on his own. So that's definitely an interesting one to keep out for. And obviously, aiming for the constructors, I don't think anyone would have predicted that for McLaren going into the season. I mean, I put a bet on P2, and I think that was optimistic at the time. So, I mean,
I look like a very smart man at the moment at this point. It
isn't, because if they win, obviously, if they win the constructors, I've lost. But I'll be like, damn, but also good news for McLaren. But we'll move on to a little bit of a rounding up, should we say? A few little stories of McLaren in the news. And it's that time of year. Well, not time of year, but it's a typically F1 story, isn't it? Of teams not being happy about other teams that's suddenly a little bit quicker. So if you missed this one, it's regarding Red Bull and sort of what they call a flexi wing of both McLaren and Ferrari. And I mean, the term flexi wing gets used so much. And like, for people who don't know, it's essentially your front wing isn't allowed to flex, hence the term. And that sort of, or move in any kind of way. And Red Bull are sort of hinting that McLaren and Ferrari are being a little bit liberal of this. I mean, the report comes from a German source, so it's Automotor and Sport. So it's, to be fair, it's quite reliable. They're usually quite on the nose. And they say and it was a lovely translation. It's Red Bull are more openly with the finger pointing. So basically saying this isn't on, and said if it's tolerated, they might have to do something similar. So it's a little bit of a tennis match. I think you could say it. Sort of, we're going to complain this, but we'll see what happens. But Adam, what do you make of it? Is this gossip? Is this something to be concerned about? I mean, we have occasionally seen these kind of things result in technical directives, which obviously bans that particular rule. But what do you make of this whole story? Do you think it's just F1 teams being petty in the way they tend to be petty when they're not getting their way?
I think it's just part and parcel of how the sport is. I mean, we get a lot of new fans that hear these kind of stories or see them and they just think, oh, it's just such and such complaining. And most of the time it usually is just hot air. But I think just seeing news stories like that suggests what we've been talking about, that perhaps Red Bull are starting to sweat a little bit. They are starting to be concerned that, not just with their own car, but, we've heard so many stories about how this concept has its limits, and they changed the concept last season because of the limits on the RB19. And now they're starting to worry about the limits of the RB20. And McLaren and Ferrari are not far away from them at all. So, seeing stories like this just confirms what we were talking about earlier. I think Red Bull are starting to sweat about the prospects of being beaten by these two teams and being overtaken in the development race. Now, I don't want to get carried away because I have said a lot on this show, in this episode in particular, about how Red Bull could be very vulnerable right now. But it does have all the hallmarks of that. I think I heard somewhere, I don't know how true this was, that Red Bull were trying to lobby Aston Martin to try and weigh in on this as well. But I think Aston Martin said, well, no, we're not going to do that because we actually have our own version of that kind of wing in the works. So, yeah, and there was the other one about Mercedes as well with their front wing update. So, as I said, I would not discourage Red Bull from doing this if they feel they have a genuine case here. And I think it's one of those where we see, Red Bull are just moaning because they're worried about their advantage being eaten away. That's how it can be taken by some fans. But I think the takeaway from that, Sam, is that they are starting to worry about their rivals again. And that can only be good for the sport above anything else. But it's also great for McLaren. So, we've got to get on side with that.
It reminds me of a moment in one of the earlier seasons of Drive to Survive. And it was when, you might remember this, when obviously Mercedes had the dual axis system, DAS. And there was a clip of Horner and Wolff walking to some kind of meeting. And Horner was like, oh, it's very clever, very clever. And he sort of ends and goes, we will protest it. We'll definitely we'll protest it, but I've got to amend you. It's very clever. So this is just part and parcel, like you say.
Well, what was it Christian said famously? If you have a problem with your car, change it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say the actual quote because I'm sure this is a PG show, but change your effing car.
Yeah, exactly. And it's typical F1. But the final story we're going to touch on sort of related to F1 in McLaren's sense, but also not in a way. It's focused on the IndyCar team a bit. And if anyone's seen this, it's obviously Alex Palou, who was supposed to join McLaren this year. In the end, didn't happen. He sort of backed out of it, and essentially, it's boiled down to a messy legal case. McLaren are currently claiming over 30 million in damages from Palou after he didn't sign the contract with McLaren. He's still racing with Chip Ganassi in IndyCar. I know, just say he got 7th in Le Mans, which I thought was a very respectable score, very respectable finish for a driver who doesn't spend a huge amount of time in sports cars. But the thing I wanted to bring up was it's something that's come out in the court documents of late, and this is something the race reported on, that he could still join McLaren or any F1 team if he's offered a 2025 seat, and obviously there's still a few seats available. But the reason I sort of brought it up is I wanted to ask you, Adam, like, Alex Palou is obviously a very skilled driver. He's a 2-time IndyCar world champion. And perhaps if he'd stayed with McLaren, he might have got an F1 chance. But do you think we're ever going to see him in F1? He's a name that's not really talked about for F1 seats. I mean, we're discussing all these vacancies next year. And I haven't heard anyone sort of bring up his name. Whereas in IndyCar, he's absolutely smashing it. He's the reigning world champion. He's won it twice already. Like, do you think we're ever going to see a time where he's in F1, or do you think he's just forever sort of missed the boat on that?
Unfortunately, I would probably have to say no, and I'd probably go as far as saying, was the boat really at the docks for him to really get on it? Because a lot of the talk from IndyCar, or even from America, is if there's ever going to be an American driver from that series coming into F1, Colton Herta is probably the first point in call. Now, of course, Alex Palou has the connections to McLaren, obviously the history there. I just think there's just so much well, not bad blood, but there's so much there that you've already talked about that I just can't see a scenario where bridges can be mended to such a degree where he could see himself on the grid. I mean, we talked about Pato O'Ward being another driver that might be probably more likely linked to driving for McLaren or an F1 team. And then there's that whole business with the changes to the super license rules now. I mean, we know why that's happened. We're not going to talk about that in particular. So could Alex drive for another F1 team? Yeah, it's absolutely feasible that he could. I think there's no skill issue here. You know, this is a guy, as you rightly pointed out, I think he did a great job to finish in the top 7 at Le Mans. I think people tend to undervalue how hard it is to do well in sports cars just because some F1 drivers go over there and do it. But let's be honest, they always end up in the top cars. So why wouldn't they be in the mix to win? So, yeah, as much as I would love to see it happen, I think the only way it probably does happen is if Andretti miraculously end up on the grid anytime soon, and Alex Palou's stock is still pretty high in the Indy Series, where Michael and Mario Andretti say, yeah, let's get him in on top of perhaps someone like Colton Herta, for example. So unless that happens, I just unfortunately don't see a way in for Alex Palou. And look at the other seats as well, Sam. I mean, look at the current F1 grid at this point in time. It's just drivers moving around everywhere. It's like a big game of musical chairs. So for that reason, I just don't see a way that a driver outside of F1 is actually going to get into the sport, let alone Indy car, unfortunately. So yeah, apologies, Indy fans, but I feel that that's just the reality right now.
Yeah, and I mean, you only have to look at the F2 champions of recent years. Other than Piastri, obviously, we've had Felipe Drogovic, who I haven't heard linked to a seat despite him being an Aston Martin reserve driver. We've had Teo Pourchaire, who's obviously now gone off to IndyCar as well to sort of get some drivers. So yeah, I think you're right. Like, I think Alex Palou is obviously a very talented driver, but I just don't think I can see a way onto the F1 grid. And I think if anyone saw this interview with Sainz as well, he just reminded me of it. He said there's only going to be 2 new drivers next year. I mean, I don't know if he's just made that number off the top of his head or if he knows it. And sort of looking around the grid, you perhaps maybe say that's going to be Liam Lawson, maybe Jack Doohan, or maybe Kimi Antonelli as well. So it sounds like next year's grid may be a little bit more shored up than we currently know of it so far. And yeah, obviously Sainz is a big factor in that, where he chooses to go. But we'll sort of keep an eye on that in the future. We'll maybe bring that up a later date. But let's round off today with predictions. And I think, unfortunately for you, the bar has been set very high, because the last time we did this was Sarah McKenzie and she got it bang on. So that's a very high bar. You can't beat the bar, you can equal the bar. So what are your predictions place-wise for both the McLaren drivers this weekend?
Well, I'm just going to put it out there that my wheel knowledge couldn't hold a candle to Sarah's. I'll put that out there right now. So just to take some of the pressure off me, I'll never hit those heights. Do you know what? This is the worst thing in the world being asked as a Ferrari fan, because I want to say I expect a double podium from McLaren, but I just feel that Ferrari are going to be in that mix as well. So to be generous to myself and generous to you and your wonderful listeners who obviously want McLaren to do well, Sam, or at least I hope they do, I'm going to say I expect a podium from Lando, and I think he's going to be up there with Leclerc and Verstappen. Do I need to give a specific position?
I mean, Sarah did. If you want to really want to boil it down, but
I'll be that guy. I think the top 3 is going to be Max P1, Leclerc P2, and Norris P3.
I'm very inclined to agree with you. Not believe you, sorry. I do believe you. I'm very inclined to agree with you, because I think, personally, I think it's going to be a super exciting race. I think we've got a lot of teams that look like they could do well. And I think you're right. I think that's going to be, I'll maybe swap Norris and Leclerc, because I think Norris is in such good form that only really Verstappen sort of can say he's a more informed driver. So maybe that gives him a little bit of an edge if the cars are quite close. But I think Red Bull, McLaren, and Ferrari is a great shout. Not entirely sure the Mercedes sort of upturn of form is going to continue this weekend, but we shall see. But yeah, why not? I'm going to go Verstappen win. Unfortunately, I think it's just a circuit that Red Bull are so good at. Verstappen himself is really good at. And I think once the curbs have gone that we've seen in Canada and Monaco, I think we're now going to start to see the best of him. So I'm going to go Max first, Lando second, Leclerc third, and then I think Piastri is going to be sort of in that little group behind, so maybe battling Sainz for the P4 kind of area, but somewhere around there, P4, P5. But still another healthy point score that we all hope for. And I'm actually going to be in Spain, so we're going to leave the review podcast till Monday. So hopefully we'll have had an exciting race. We can sort of recap all the action. But in the meantime, a huge thanks to Adam once again for joining me. And thanks to you all for listening. I'm sure we'll catch you at a later point. But yeah, thanks again for Adam for joining me today.
Yeah, pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me.
That's all for our preview pod this week. A huge thanks to Adam once again for joining me, and a huge thanks to you as well for listening along. Like I said, we're going to be back on Monday for a full review of the race, but in the meantime, you can follow us on socials at Pondering Papaya, and make sure you're subscribed in your favourite podcast app so you never miss an episode. We'll see you on Monday.